This is episode 590 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, I had a chance last week to head down to one of the more conservative areas of the state, Alamogordo, and gave a talk to a Rotary club. And I'll say if folks are listening out there and they are involved in Rotary or an FRW group or any other organization that can handle the message of the Rio Grande Foundation, I say that because
you want the truth.
Yeah, you can't handle the truth, but you got to have the right group for this kind of thing. Some groups don't get anywhere near politics. Some groups are happy to have politically motivated, oriented speakers. I look at us being outside of the political process, but a lot of folks don't want to hear something that's so overtly public policy oriented, and that's fine. So, but if you are interested, please reach out and let us know. Just check riograndefoundation.org and you can find out how to do that. But drove down to Alamogordo and had a nice time down there with folks. Do a Tuesday morning every week, really every week, except for the week between Christmas and New Year's, conversation for about a half hour with a radio station down in Alamogordo. Bob Flott and Mike Derler are the two gentlemen who are involved in that, and got to catch up with them in person. Also got from another radio colleague or friend, Mike Shinneberry, who is involved with the New Mexico Space History Museum. Got a little behind the scenes down there at the museum. Have you been to the New Mexico Space History Museum?
Yes, I have. It's been a number of years, but I thought it was very interesting. It's not huge, which is, I think, a strength as much of a weakness. It's like not one of those where you have to walk 10 miles to see all the exhibits. Yeah, very interesting. And, considering New Mexico's tie, but even without that, it's just a very interesting museum and kind of a cool building in a cool part of town.
Yeah, it's kind of getting up into the foothills, if you will, of the mountains. I'm not sure exactly what.
The Sacramento.
Those are the I'm sure they have a name for that particular mountain or hill, but the Sacramentos is the general range down there. Specifically got to see a 3.7 billion year old moon rock brought back by Harrison Schmidt, former state senator from New Mexico, or U.S. senator from New Mexico, and saw a tornado, a British tornado jet, not the kind of tornado that destroys houses.
Not the anti-M type of tornado.
Yes, no, Dorothy and Toto were not harmed, but it was a German tornado that was used at the training that the Germans used to do military training at White Sands. And I guess they left behind one of their tornado jets that sits outside. So a lot of interesting pieces. And of course, having somebody who works there telling me about it, some new exhibits that they've got going on down there. So if your travel plans take you to Alamogordo, or if you're just a space buff and you have a chance to go on a staycation weekend, definitely recommend it. It's spring break, not quite as hot as it can get down in Alamogordo.
Yeah, a lot of good things to see down there. You have White Sands, Cloudcroft is nice, and the Space Museum. There's a lot to do there. It's always good to not go to the White Sands when the wind blows. So if you get a windy day, you might do the Space Museum. But yeah, Paul, I'm a former resident, first and second grade in Alamogordo. So
there you go. And of course, John Block, the rep from Alamogordo, was on Tipping Point, and they are going through a little bit of a shift, as so many, I believe, 20 plus members of either the state Senate or the state House are switching out. But Senators Burt and Griggs, who represent but various areas around Alamogordo, are retiring. So they are amongst the many, many different folks who will be leaving the legislature, and just the start of new faces that we're going to see up in Santa Fe. Of course, we've got primary elections and general elections to go before we know how that body will really look. So it's been a flurry after the legislative session. Now, finally, deadlines have come and gone, and we know pretty much who is running to be up in Santa Fe. So speaking of not so much Santa Fe, but policies of Santa Fe, that's kind of our cause raison d'etre here at Tipping Point, New Mexico. Uh, there's so many stories that I would love reporters, especially in print, because I feel like that's where you really get the most in-depth analysis. I really wish that some of these reporters were willing to take on things like, gee, New Mexico's really got a lot of money right now. Why aren't we doing better as a state with all that money? I mean, you can see like a pulse, but we're not really kicking butt and taking names right now. Instead, we get stories like this from the Albuquerque Journal, which highlight a handful of Texans moving to New Mexico. And the article is why New Mexico is seeing more Texans come into the state. March 11th, 2024, by yet another new Journal reporter, Mallet Habtes. Not sure how to pronounce their name, but it basically says, hey, there's been an uptick in the number of Texans moving to New Mexico. And, we are neighbors of Texas here in New Mexico, and there's oftentimes easy transition from one state to the other because of that geographical proximity. And, overall, the story does rightly note that Texas is growing at about 16%. I actually think their data is wrong, because the article states that Texas is growing at a 16% annual rate, while New Mexico is growing at a 2.8% annual rate. 16% annually in a state the size of Texas strikes me as a little bit too much, but that was from the article.
Well, and Paul, I sort of think maybe that's the growth over a number of years.
Yeah, like a decade.
And the same with New Mexico. New Mexico did not grow 2.1% in any recent year that I know of. So maybe that's just, it wouldn't be the first reporter to get tripped up with math. So.
Yeah, and we talk about Texas and New Mexico, and Texas is generally a more economically free, smaller government, free market state, but these are general terms. They have what I think by all means, by all accounts, is a bigger but less geographically beautiful place to live there in Texas. There are places, of course, that are beautiful, and they have oceanfront property in the southeastern part of the state, but they do tax property heavily in Texas, whereas New Mexico has relatively light property tax burdens. They have no personal income tax in Texas, and we do have an income tax in Texas and the gross receipts tax to boot. So there's various differences and similarities between the two places. The story from the Journal does fixate a little bit on LBGT rights, which Texas is a much more conservative place. They've embraced a more skeptical approach to those issues. New Mexico has been much more avant-garde in kind of pushing the envelope in favor of the LBGTQ issue. And I would say that Texas is not a particularly, there's a lot of reasons why you might not want to retire to Texas. Number one is the property tax issue. Number two is the weather. Maybe you can flip those. I don't know. It depends on your priorities. But we do have an aging population in this country. And New Mexico, the thing that keeps holding us back is our Social Security tax. We can't just get rid of it like more than 40 other states have. Apparently, we're now one of number 9 states that just have this property tax or this Social Security tax in place. Last I saw was 10, but now I saw a list with just 9 states. If New Mexico really wants to, and I know there's people out there who do not want any Texans to move to New Mexico, but they have money, and retirees from across the country. You can't really discriminate against Texans just because you don't like Texans. You can't say we will be an unfriendly place to retire. These people bring money. They bring jobs and job potential there. Some of them still are working and paying taxes, even though they're semi-retired, volunteer time, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, New Mexico should be in the business of, at very least, bringing more retirees from Texas and other states to come to New Mexico, because I think it's good business for the state. And all we have to do is eliminate that Social Security tax. I think that moves us in a much more positive direction when it comes to retirement destinations.
Yeah, there's no question. And it just seems like in Santa Fe that they just don't want to do things like that, because despite the fact that it would benefit, thousands and thousands of retirees, a few of those retirees are rich, Paul, and we need to get every last penny out of them. And if we have to mess up the economy for retirees moving here, that's a small price to pay. And it just does seem like it's that simple, that they see taxes as a good in and of themselves, as opposed to a necessary evil, something that needs to be managed and done with the least amount of damage, other than the fact that they're taking money from you. But, that's where New Mexico is.
Yeah, it's just frustrating. I mean, obviously these people will likely vote, and I'm sure some number of Texans do vote in New Mexico elections once they decide that they want to be residents here. I'm sure some of them maintain property in Texas as well as New Mexico, and
Dual residency.
yeah, and probably continue to pay their income tax in the state of Texas. There was a proposal a few years ago to really try to come after the Texans for their property taxes in the state of New Mexico and jack those rates up. So, I guess you got some good, you got some bad, and at least from the perspective of the ruling classes of New Mexico. And the question is, are we going to try to grow as a state, or are we just going to stagnate? And it seems like, again, the politicians and, to an extent, the people who vote for those politicians would prefer stagnation to economic growth. But yeah, just thought that was a interesting kind of choice in a story. Suddenly some group of Texans are moving here. Let's do a story about it, when there's a lot of other topics that are more relevant and more impactful.
Well, maybe, Paul, that's the man bites dog story.
Yeah.
It's so rare. It's so rare, but we have uncovered here at our publication the fact that a couple of Texans moved to New Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now, eliminating the Social Security tax is a big deal. It would be nice to see, but I'm going to put forth a bold statement here, Wally. We could eliminate all taxes paid to the state of New Mexico pretty darn easily. Now, a new graphic from the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association touts $13.9 billion in revenue in fiscal year 2023 from oil and gas. 7.5 billion of that is dedicated to the general fund, 6.4 billion to the non-general fund. Well, let's just take that as that number stands. I looked at recent budget documents, and it's kind of hard to believe, given that the FY25 budget that we just saw pass in Santa Fe is $10.19 billion, first ever general fund budget in excess of $10 billion. But way back in fiscal year 2022, a whopping 3 budget cycles ago, the state general fund was $7.4 billion, meaning that we're basically 1 year off from having enough money coming in from oil and gas to pay the entire state general fund worth of budget. And that's not even including the fact that there's this other $6.4 billion just kind of sitting there in the permanent funds. And, you know, I have to say that if I were governor and I had even the slightest opportunity, I would, after I got done slashing taxes, making New Mexico right to work, repealing Davis-Bacon, and doing all these other things, rampant school choice, I would try to figure out a way to make the permanent fund situation make sense.
Yeah.
But so it's like Rush Limbaugh, you know, fighting with one arm tied, half his brain tied behind his back. That's the way New Mexico's kind of dealing with this situation. Is we have more than enough money to pay for our general fund budget. You know, we could pay for these institutions, the public schools, the universities, et cetera, with those permanent fund dollars, but we could also demand efficiency and cost effectiveness. I mean, we're also paying for free college, the rail runner, the spaceport, film subsidies, all kinds of other little projects and policies, capital outlay that don't really make sense within the grand scheme of things. Anyway, the point is that you know, maybe if I were king, if I were governor, I wouldn't necessarily eliminate everybody's taxes. I'd go with like a 5% sales tax.
Not on services, just on products.
Yeah, just a straight sales tax.
Yeah,
but
and then go for there.
That's just off the top of my head. But the point is that New Mexicans should basically not have to pay taxes, personal income, capital gains, corporate income tax. Imagine the prosperity of our state then.
Yes. And let me just put one little asterisk. Let me go ahead and give you your fantasy and say every bit of that is implemented. If you were to get that implemented, you know, one of the things that businesses in particular look for in a state is stability. And so they would need some confidence that, you know, the next administration, they were going to completely undo all of those things. But yes. And then the other thing, Paul, I don't know, call this a pet peeve of mine, but we have all this money. And if you've driven around New Mexico, the roads are in horrible, horrible shape.
True.
And I realize, guess what? We get taxes from gasoline and diesel to do the roads, but we could throw a little money that way as well. What if we had the best road? You know, right now, we don't know what else to do with the money. It's like, why not fix our roads that, you know, around the state, there's places, Paul, where they're downright dangerous. You know, the potholes are now starting to be named as waterways that need to be managed. Wetlands, they're so big. So we need to do something about that as well. But doesn't seem like we can do anything other than add to bureaucracy. That seems to be our superpower right now in state government.
Yeah, no question there. It's you know, it is a fantasy given the political situation in New Mexico, but it's eminently realistic. And I will now share some data that shows just how realistic this is. And we're going to kind of come to the discussion of this through national energy policy, not the state, but we will get there in the shortest of times. None other than Vox. Now, folks, we don't use Vox articles very often, but I stumbled upon this article from March 13th, 2024, on the Vox websites. Biden isn't advertising America's record oil boom. Now, I get both sides critiquing me when I talk about this stuff, because there is an element of kind of conservatives who say, well, you know, Biden's trying to kill the oil and gas industry. And I agree, he is. We could be even doing better if it were not for his bad policies, his anti-energy policies, including the Keystone XL pipeline, permitting delays, et cetera, et cetera. The prices we pay for oil and gas right now could be much, much lower. However, the reality is that the free markets and demand globally for energy still is surpassing and overcoming Biden's misguided policies on energy, which ultimately are either failing or he's flat out changed them in order to be accommodating to reality on energy. This is kind of the Jurassic Park argument. Nature finds a way here. So Vox notes that the United States is the largest crude oil producer in the world, pumping out 13 billion barrels on an average day in 2023, an all-time record, according to data from the Energy Information Administration. They note that's an awkward milestone for Joe Biden, who they say has arguably done more than any other modern president to transition away from fossil fuels to what they call greener alternatives. We've outstripped Russia and Saudi Arabia and OPEC in production. And, things are obviously booming in the oil and gas industry. And, Biden has definitely been a skeptic on energy. He came into office talking very big, but hasn't quite worked out that way. Of course, as I say, he could, if he was a pro-energy president, be doing even more to embrace this oil boom, embrace, trying to use economic policy to undermine Russia, for example, on the global stage, from a foreign policy perspective, just by flooding the energy markets, keeping prices down. Also, liquefied natural gas exports, if he'd embrace those instead of trying to cut down on those, cleaning the air, less CO2 emissions, less coal, et cetera, more money flowing into the United States. So anyway, your comments on this Vox story, I thought it was really neat, especially coming from kind of a anti-energy news source.
Yeah, well, yes, I read Vox stories from time to time too. I usually
They're
roll
not
my
they're
no,
not terrible.
they're not
Yeah.
horrible. It's one of those. I will say, in their defense, is that even if you disagree with their premise on certain stories, they put enough information in there that you could at least see a hint of both sides. But well, here's my take, Paul. It's like we're in this kind of interim fantasy world with regard to energy. We think that wind, solar, and batteries are going to be all that can carry the day, and it's just not true with today's generation, particularly of batteries. And so, to go back to oil and gas, right now, what makes the electric market as affordable as it is the fact that the associated gas from all this oil production can be used to generate electricity. Well, if they're actually successful in slowing down the oil production, it will raise the gas prices, and who knows what that would do to the price of electricity. The other thing, and again, a parallel to this Vox story, not exactly, but there's fears now that demand is far going to exceed supply in the electric markets. Why? Well, there's a reshoring of manufacturing that's coming from, a reduction of international trade with China and others. We have data centers, we have AI, and guess what? We have EVs. And so we have a lot of uses of electricity, and we've done a fantastic job of pressuring coal power plants to close down, but not necessarily looking at the big picture in terms of what's necessary for not only new generation but transmission to hook it up. So yeah, we are in a position where things are going great right now. And guess what? The savior of all U.S. energy, in my mind, is the oil and gas sector, because that natural gas is so cheap for electricity. Oil keeps, now, it's not super cheap. Don't get me wrong. It's not $40 a barrel, and gas isn't $1.50 a gallon. But, think of what it would be without the U.S. ramping up its production over the last several years. And so we're going to have some reckonings coming up, and we're not the only country that's had them. We will not be the first. A lot of Europe is having their energy reckoning and having to do things like reopen coal plants. The U.S. has made a lot of, in the words of Rooster Cogburn, mighty bold talk. We have some mighty bold talk about what's going to happen by 2025, 2030, 2035, and so on. But there's not even action at really a level that's going to get us there at this point.
So I'm looking at right now, before we move to the state level, Crude oil price on Yahoo Finance, $83.27, up another 0.66% as we record today. So prices continue to go up and show no signs of abating. I mean, obviously, these things are cyclical, but my experience is that generally prices at the pump and prices of oil itself go up in the springtime in anticipation of the summer driving season demand. There's always the switchover.
Yeah, the switchover increases the difference between oil prices and gasoline. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, this industry is not going anywhere. We just talked a little bit about the financial aspect and specifically pertaining to New Mexico. And I think the biggest takeaway there, and I'm going to get into some numbers in terms of production specifically here at the state level, but the mindset that we see out of Santa Fe that we are going to be dealing with some kind of oil production bust in the not too distant future is belied not only by the federal data we just saw, but New Mexico is actually a big part of that federal data because we are the second biggest producer in the nation. So here's a few interesting points. Again, data directly from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. December of 2023, the last month we have available, we as a state produced about 60 million barrels of oil in that particular month. That is, as it has been, a record of production. Here's some, I think, interesting stats. So that is double where production was back in, July of 2020. Now, there was a little bit of a hiccup there. Because of the COVID pandemic and the shutdown of basically modern society, hovered around that 30,000 or 30 million mark for a while. So around the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we were at 30 million barrels as a state. So doubling since basically the early days of COVID. The previous amount, so quadrupling since September of 2017. Sextupling since early 2014. We're going in the exact wrong direction to be a bust. We're going in a direction where we're continuing to grow and grow and grow. That means more jobs, more money, more opportunity for the folks in Santa Fe to do something worthwhile with that revenue. And yet again, we have had another legislative session where nothing really worthwhile has been done with the revenue. I think 90% of that is just the pure economic ignorance of the folks that we elect, and the hostility towards free markets and economic growth. But 10% of it may be the ignorance of the oil and gas industry and some genuine concerns about the future of the industry. Well, the future is so bright, you got to wear shades.
Yeah, it is very bright indeed. And, kind of to tie New Mexico and the national picture for energy together, with New Mexico being such a large producer, when we were third, fourth, fifth, sixth in oil production, the oil industry was not on the Rolodex of those in Washington, but just as happened a few years ago when the U.S. federal government begged OPEC to increase their production, there could come a time in the not too distant future where a current or future administration might call to Santa Fe and say, you got to let some more oil out. You're hurting the country. So that's the level of New Mexico oil production and its impact where we are as a country.
There you go. That would be the tin pot dictator of New Mexico. We won't name any names, but we've already kind of got
I just said current or future, current or future.
All of this unfolding with the oil and gas industry, and yet, according to a new report from Wallethub, we remain the second most dependent state on the federal government. Now, just to give you an idea of where we are, according to Wallethub, we get $3.26 for every dollar we pay in taxes here in the land of enchantment. Uh, and there's some reasons for that, both good and bad. According to every data point that you can find out there, we know New Mexico has large military installations, the Department of Energy, Los Alamos and Sandia. You also have large tracts of federally owned land. The number one state, by the way, where number two is Alaska. So that's not a surprise, a geographically dispersed state in a area of relatively high national security interest. They're not as poor, certainly as New Mexico is, but there's some good reasons why Alaska has a lot of that dependency. New Mexico definitely has the poverty, and that generates the additional dependency. And so, I think the question is, do we want to do better? Do we want to develop our economy more, be a little less dependent on Washington? And in the off case, which I find much more likely that the federal government experiences some financial turmoil than the oil and gas industry experiences problems in the not too distant future. We can skate by without having to deal with problems in Washington, D.C. So, interesting report. I'll only say this, that New Jersey, California, Kansas, Utah, Illinois, least federally dependent states in the nation. So relative paucity of federal lands, not much in the way of military installations in those states relative to the population size, certainly. So, and more or less, a lot of blue states on that list too. So, interesting data points.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this always been the case, Paul. People talked about the last I had heard, which is literally decades ago. It was like 1.97, and then 2 point. It's really risen a lot here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and again, we are definitionally going to be, to an extent, reliant on Washington because of those labs. And the reason we have the Air Force here is because we have such lovely flying weather, blue skies, wide open spaces. You can, break the sound barrier without upsetting quite as many people, et cetera. So there's some good reasons for it. But again, I don't think you want to be at the very, very top of the list of dependent on the federal government, especially given the state of their budget situation and the debt and indebtedness that they face, and et cetera. So
Yeah, and just picture New Mexico with a 20% larger private economy. What that would do to that percentage is it would reduce it a bit. And that's kind of the theme that's tying a lot of these things together, is that there is the money that policies can be implemented that can really help that along. But we're having a hard time even getting to the starting line, much less starting that race.
exactly. So next step here, we are talking about the latest in boondoggles coming from, in this case, the city of Albuquerque. I find this one to be a big boondoggle, even by Albuquerque standards, which is that's saying something. So on March 18th, that would be yesterday as we record, the city of Albuquerque has created and is operating a new ride-sharing service using, I believe, 5 electric vans to roam around the city of Albuquerque and take people from place to place. It's going to currently start in the South Valley and North Valley areas, which is an interesting approach. I assume that you can get where you need to go, like, the airport or something. But the fact that the government is jumping into the ride-sharing business by itself is the most bizarre aspect. So we have done a public records request to find out how much money is being spent, where the money is coming from. This so-called free service will cost the city about $26 per ride, which that is basically traveling from the end to the other end of Albuquerque during rush hour. I've taken my Ubers and Lyfts around this town, and
Right.
that's $26 for a single ride is very, very much on the upper end of the price tag there. So
But you don't have to pay. Is that correct?
it's
That's what it
free.
costs. That's not what you pay.
Cost to the taxpayer,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, Paul. Other public transportation in Albuquerque has been integrated into organized shoplifting. So it's like, hey, I need a ride from Target, but don't pick me up right in front. I'm going to go ahead and run about a quarter mile away from Target, and could you pick me up quickly because people are after me? So we'll see what happens. There's senior vans, Paul, and
Yep.
I can see that. By the way, it's like that one doesn't. It's interesting to see who the clientele for this will be, and who what the usage will be, and like many of these things, heck, free bus service, they mess it up just because it doesn't cost if the service is so dysfunctional like the bus service has gotten to be with all the problems on the bus routes. So we'll see if this happens. So
Well, I'm looking for reliability of these lovely electric vehicle buses. I'm looking for, in a public records request, I've already got a request out to find out the annual spending on the program, as well as where that money is coming from. Is this something that is purely financed by City of Albuquerque taxpayers, or are we using state money, or are we somehow rolling in federal dollars that are going to be used for this particular program? So we'll see more to come on the city's rideshare program. Obviously, just generally as a free marketeer, never like to see government getting into competition with private sector businesses. Obviously, you and I both used Uber and Lyft, and I think it's safe to say that we generally find them to be convenient and useful services. And now you get the city of Albuquerque jumping into the game unnecessarily, in my estimation.
yeah, Paul, if it were a question of there's a group that really needs a ride and we don't want to put a big service in place, there's businesses already that will give you an Uber voucher. If you go to your car dealer to get your car serviced and you don't have a ride, they'll say, "Hey, we've got an Uber voucher we'll give you." They text you a number and things happen from there.
Yeah,
So,
they do that all the time around the holidays.
yeah.
With
Yeah, drunk driving and
just hit St. Patty's Day. That's
yeah.
a good Uber holiday right
Speaking
there.
of drinking holidays.
Yeah, and want to recognize somebody we're going to have on for our interview this week, but want to make sure we mention his column in the Albuquerque Journal because it takes on the system. We just talked about it last week, the capital outlay system in New Mexico. Retiring state senator Bill Tallman in the Albuquerque Journal discussing the lack of prioritization, the lack of a statewide vision, and kind of a way to analyze and make sure that money flows to the highest priorities for these projects. And of course, we just talked earlier in the show about the fact that the roads and bridges in New Mexico are not in particularly great shape. Prices, of course, have skyrocketed in construction, so that's a factor that needs to be addressed as well. But good column from Senator Tallman. Definitely an issue that is unfortunately an evergreen issue in New Mexico. The capital outlay process is one of those that just never seems to get reformed. But
In nearly 600 episodes, we've talked about it a half a dozen times. It's
yeah,
been there, it's been bad. And Paul, it's gone from bad to horrible to, in the words of Spaceballs, ludicrous bad right now. We have so much money out there and it's just wasted. It's being wasted. And, something needs to happen. And will it happen soon? We will see. So I'm interested to hear what Senator Tallman has to say on that topic.
yeah, and $5.2 billion just sitting idle, which is one of the ways that the state seems to hoard large piles of cash, like what we were talking about from oil and gas, is just to stick it in some of these funds and almost forget it. Now, they're not even investing it in a lot of cases, and it's just truly sitting there losing its purchasing power on a day-to-day basis. So that's where we're going to end it for now. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.